You're driving through America legally armed with a valid concealed carry permit from your home state. You've done everything right, followed every rule, completed all the training, passed every background check. You're 100% legal, and then you cross a state border. Nothing about your behavior changes, nothing about your firearm changes, nothing about your qualifications changes, but suddenly you're a felon facing years in prison. 1 minute you're a law-abiding citizen, the next minute you're looking at felony charges that will destroy your life forever. That's not a hypothetical scenario designed to scare you. That's the reality facing millions of gun owners right now in February 2026, and it's been happening for decades while lawmakers did absolutely nothing to fix it. This is about 10 rules in H.R. 38, the National Concealed Carry Reciprocity legislation that could finally end the legal nightmare that's been turning responsible Americans into criminals just for crossing invisible state lines. For years, for decades actually, the system has operated like a trap designed to catch people who are trying to follow the law. Your rights stop at your state border, while your driver's license, your marriage license, every other legal credential you possess works nationwide without question. But your Second Amendment rights? Those get thrown in the trash the second you cross into the wrong state? And the consequences aren't warnings or small fines. They're felony charges, prison sentences, permanent loss of your gun rights, destruction of your career, and complete devastation of your family. This has been going on for so long that people have started to accept it as normal, as just the way things are, as something gun owners have to live with. But it's not normal, it's not acceptable. And H.R. 38 represents the first real opportunity in generations to fix a broken system that never should have existed in the first place. If you're tired of watching responsible gun owners get destroyed by a patchwork of conflicting state laws, if you believe constitutional rights shouldn't vanish at state borders, if you think it's time someone actually held government accountable for this disaster, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Because what I'm breaking down today are the 10 specific changes that could transform how concealed carry works in America. And mainstream media isn't covering this with the urgency and detail it deserves. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let's expose exactly what's at stake and why this matters more than most people realize. Here's the first fundamental change that H.R. 38 would bring, and it's the one that addresses the core insanity of the current system. Your concealed carry permit would finally travel with you across state lines exactly like your driver's license does. Right now, your permit might protect you completely in your home state, but it becomes worthless and potentially dangerous the moment you cross certain borders. 1 minute you're legal, the next you're risking felony charges for doing absolutely nothing wrong except entering another state's jurisdiction. H.R. 38 would put an end to that confusion permanently. If this legislation becomes law, your home state's permit would be recognized in every other state that allows concealed carry. Just like your driver's license works nationwide without anyone questioning it, without anyone demanding you get a separate license for each state you drive through, your carry permit would finally follow you wherever you go across America. No more spending hours checking reciprocity maps that change constantly. No more worrying whether Pennsylvania accepts your Florida permit or whether Ohio recognizes your Texas credentials. No more fear that a simple stop for gas in the wrong state could lead to your arrest and prosecution. This change brings the clarity and freedom that should have existed from the beginning. Whether you're taking a weekend trip with your family, delivering goods across state lines for your job, or simply traveling for work that requires you to move between jurisdictions, your permit would stay valid the entire way without you having to become a legal expert in 50 different state codes. Look at the real-world cases of people like David McCoy and Jeffrey Johnson. Both were professional truck drivers. Both possessed valid concealed carry permits from Texas and Florida, respectively. But when they drove through Minnesota as part of their regular delivery routes, those permits were completely ignored by local authorities. They were left legally exposed and vulnerable to prosecution for doing their jobs, for making a living, for traveling through a state that decided their home state credentials meant nothing. Under H.R. 38, that risk disappears completely. Their home state approval would protect them across the entire country, and they could focus on their work instead of constantly worrying about which states recognize their permits and which states treat them like criminals. This rule ensures your rights actually stay with you no matter where you travel, and that's how constitutional protections are supposed to work in a country that claims to value freedom. Now, here's the change that could be life-altering for millions of Americans who live in constitutional carry states. If you're in one of the many states that now allows law-abiding citizens to carry concealed without needing a permit at all, this update represents a massive expansion of your practical freedom. Right now, more than half the country lets responsible citizens carry a concealed firearm without jumping through permit hoops. States like Texas, Alabama, and Tennessee already trust their residents to exercise that right freely without government permission slips. But the moment you cross into a state that still requires a permit, that freedom can vanish instantly. And with it, your legal protection disappears and you're suddenly vulnerable to arrest and prosecution. That's where things get genuinely dangerous for people who are trying to follow the law. Thousands of responsible gun owners have been trapped in an impossible no-win situation. Either get a permit they don't actually need in their home state, spending time and money on something their own state doesn't require, or take the massive legal gamble of traveling without one and hoping they don't get stopped or searched in the wrong jurisdiction. For some people, that gamble has ended in felony charges and actual jail time just for visiting a different state while armed exactly as they're legally allowed to do at home. H.R. 38 changes all of that fundamentally. Under this rule, your right to carry without a permit would follow you across state lines just like your other constitutional rights do. Whether you're driving to work across a state border, taking a road trip with your family, or visiting relatives in another state, your constitutional carry status would stay with you throughout the journey. As long as you're not federally prohibited from possessing firearms, you'd be covered legally. No more fear about which states require permits and which don't. No more second-guessing your travel plans or avoiding certain states entirely because their laws are hostile to your rights. No more sacrificing your ability to defend yourself just because you crossed an invisible line on a map. For millions of Americans who've had to choose between staying home where their rights are protected or traveling and giving up their ability to defend themselves, that impossible choice finally disappears. This isn't just about convenience or making life easier. It's about restoring a basic constitutional right that should have never been tied to geography in the first place. And after years of delays, after decades of watching this problem get worse while politicians did nothing, that simple idea is finally on the verge of becoming actual law. Here's another critical change that addresses the nightmare scenario every concealed carry holder fears when they get pulled over in an unfamiliar state. If you've ever been stopped by police while carrying in another state, you know the tension and uncertainty that comes with it. You're calm, you're cooperative, you hand over your driver's license and your concealed carry permit exactly like you're supposed to. But then the officer gives you a look like he's never seen your permit before, like it's some kind of suspicious foreign document. Then come the questions, the confusion, the radio calls back to the station, and sometimes things go downhill extremely fast from there. Some officers have flat out refused to accept out-of-state permits, claiming they don't recognize them, or that their department doesn't honor them, or that they need to verify with a supervisor. And suddenly, what should have been a routine traffic stop for a broken taillight turns into a legal nightmare that could result in your arrest. H.R. 38 ends that nonsense once and for all. Under this rule, your permit becomes a recognized legal document in every single state that allows concealed carry. As long as it's valid in your home state and you're carrying in compliance with local laws, law enforcement must treat your permit as legitimate proof. No debates, no confusion, no excuses about not recognizing the format or design. This sets a clear national standard that eliminates the games. Officers can't detain you, can't escalate the situation, can't threaten you with arrest just because they don't recognize the specific design of your permit or claim they've never seen one issued from your particular state. They need actual probable cause to take it any further, real evidence that you've committed an actual crime, not just uncertainty about paperwork. If you're following the law, they have to respect it. For people like David McCoy and Jeffrey Johnson, the truck drivers who were doing their jobs completely legally but got stopped in states like Minnesota that refused to honor their permits, this rule represents a fundamental change. It means no more roadside arguments where officers treat valid permits like suspicious documents. No more intimidation tactics designed to make you admit to violations that don't exist. No more guessing games about who accepts what and whether this particular officer in this particular jurisdiction is going to honor your credentials or decide to make your day miserable. From this point forward, your permit speaks for itself, and law enforcement has to listen. Think about the case of Shaneen Allen, a mother from Pennsylvania who legally carried in her home state. During what should have been a routine traffic stop in New Jersey, she was arrested and spent 40 days in jail, facing a mandatory 3-year prison sentence, even though she had broken absolutely no law in her own state and had disclosed her firearm honestly to the officer. If H.R. 38 had been in effect, New Jersey would have been forced to recognize her Pennsylvania permit as valid, and that nightmare never would have happened to her or her family. If you're realizing just how broken this system has been for decades, if you're understanding why so many responsible gun owners live in constant fear of traveling outside their home states, then hit that like button right now and leave a comment telling me which of these 10 rules you think matters most. Because engagement on videos like this is what pushes this information to more people who need to hear it, and the more Americans who understand what H.R. 38 actually does, the harder it becomes for politicians to ignore or water down these critical protections. Like, comment, and let's keep going. Here's where H.R. 38 really flips the power dynamic in a way that's long overdue. For years, the system has worked completely backward. If a state questioned your permit, if prosecutors decided they didn't like the fact that you were carrying, you were the one forced to prove your innocence. You had to produce your training records, verify your residency, prove you weren't a criminal, prove you met every requirement, all before you'd even been formally charged with anything serious. The burden fell entirely on you to demonstrate you had done nothing wrong. H.R. 38 changes that completely and fundamentally. Now, if a prosecutor wants to come after you, if they want to charge you with illegal carry, they must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you did not meet the legal requirements. Guesses and assumptions and suspicions are no longer enough to destroy your life. They need real evidence, actual proof, not just uncertainty about whether your out-of-state permit should count. This shift protects responsible gun owners from being targeted unfairly by hostile jurisdictions that want to make examples out of people from other states. The Shaneen Allen case demonstrates exactly why this matters. She legally carried in Pennsylvania where she lived and worked. During a routine traffic stop in New Jersey, she was arrested and prosecuted and spent 40 days in jail facing a mandatory 3-year sentence, even though she had broken no law in her own state and had been completely honest with the officer about having a firearm. If H.R. 38 had been in effect at that time, New Jersey would have been forced to prove she was outside the law, and they couldn't have done it because she wasn't. Her permit was valid, her behavior was legal, and the only thing she was guilty of was crossing a state border. This rule flips the power dynamic back where it belongs. The burden now falls on the government to prove wrongdoing, not on the citizen to prove innocence. You're no longer presumed guilty simply for crossing a border with a legal firearm. This isn't a loophole or a technicality. It's a long overdue return to how the justice system is supposed to work in America, where people are innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around. And here's another protection that addresses the financial devastation that comes from wrongful arrests. In the past, even if police got it completely wrong and arrested you for carrying legally, even if you were eventually cleared of all charges, you were still the one stuck paying the price. Court costs, lawyer fees that can run into tens of thousands of dollars, missed work that costs you your job, damage to your reputation that follows you forever, all of it came out of your own pocket. The system punished the innocent and protected the agencies that made the mistakes. Under H.R. 38, that changes dramatically. If law enforcement wrongly arrests you while you're carrying legally, the burden flips entirely. The agency that made the mistake is now responsible for covering your legal expenses, your court fees, and every cost tied to proving your innocence. And if your constitutional rights were clearly violated, if they arrested you knowing your permit was valid, you can sue for damages, real money, real accountability that hits department budgets. That kind of financial pressure speaks louder than any training manual or policy memo. It forces departments to take the law seriously, train their officers properly on permit recognition, and think twice before putting handcuffs on someone who did nothing wrong. Think about Shanine Allen again. She had to hire lawyers and fight for weeks just to prove she wasn't a criminal, and all those costs came out of her pocket for having the audacity to exercise her constitutional rights across a state line. Under H.R. 38, the department that arrested her would have picked up that entire legal tab. That's not a small shift. This rule doesn't just protect your wallet from devastation. It forces real systemic change at the department level. When wrongful arrests start costing departments significant money, when budgets take hits because officers didn't bother to learn the law, policies change fast. Officer training gets better and more thorough. Following the law becomes less about individual officer opinion and more about clear legal obligation. This is not about revenge against police or punishing law enforcement. It's about responsibility and accountability, about making sure that constitutional rights are actually protected instead of just talked about. And now those protections are built directly into the law with financial teeth. This next change might be the single most important fix in the entire legislation. For decades, gun owners have lived with what legal experts and attorneys general have called the felony trap. You can leave your home fully legal, carrying exactly how your state permits and authorizes. But after just a few hours on the road, after crossing into a state like New Jersey or New York or California, you're suddenly no longer legal. You're now a felon under their state law. Nothing about your firearm changed. Nothing about your behavior or intentions changed. The only thing that changed was the name on the welcome sign at the state border. And just like that, you're facing years in prison for doing what was completely legal a few miles back. South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson called this system outrageous in official correspondence, and he's absolutely right to use that language. In a letter sent in May 2025, 24 state attorneys general agreed publicly that this patchwork of conflicting state laws turns responsible citizens into criminals just for traveling, just for moving through states as part of their normal lives. H.R. 38 shuts that trap permanently. Once passed into law, your legal status will stay with you no matter where you travel. If your home state says you're allowed to carry after vetting you and training you and running background checks, every other state has to honor that determination. States can no longer use invisible borders and conflicting laws to punish law-abiding gun owners who are simply traveling. This rule removes the fear that's been hanging over families, over truck drivers who cross state lines for work, over everyday travelers who want to visit relatives or take vacations without leaving their rights behind. No more worrying that your weekend road trip or your delivery route could lead to a felony charge and years in prison. This is not about creating loopholes or giving anyone special treatment or exempting people from reasonable laws. It's about applying constitutional rights the same way consistently across the entire country. Uniform, predictable, fair, and decades overdue. Now here's where H.R. 38 shows it's not just about expanding rights without limits. It's also about respecting boundaries that matter. Under this new rule, your concealed carry permit would be recognized across all 50 states as a valid credential. But that doesn't mean you can carry a firearm anywhere you want without any restrictions. Private property rights are still fully protected under this legislation, exactly as they should be in a free country. If a restaurant, retail store, or private business posts a clear no firearms sign at their entrance, that rule still stands and you must respect it. H.R. 38 doesn't override a homeowner's wishes about what happens on their property or a business owner's policies about their establishment. If they say no guns on their premises, you're expected to respect that decision, plain and simple. The same principle applies to government buildings and courthouses. States can still decide where firearms are allowed within their own public spaces based on legitimate security concerns. What H.R. 38 does is stop the abuse of these rules. It prevents states from hiding behind property laws to create sneaky citywide bans that confuse legal carriers or trap them in situations where the rules aren't clearly posted or publicly accessible. Some jurisdictions have tried using private property laws as a massive loophole, applying broad restrictions across entire cities that aren't clearly communicated, and that turn every street into a potential arrest zone. That kind of legal ambush ends here. H.R. 38 brings desperately needed transparency to the system. You as a legal gun owner get a clear understanding of where you can and cannot carry based on actual posted rules, and property owners keep the final say on their own land and businesses. This rule strikes the balance we've needed for years. It respects your Second Amendment rights while preserving the rights of individuals and businesses to control what happens on their own property. States can still manage their own permitting systems and designate local gun-free zones in government buildings. But what they cannot do anymore is pretend your out-of-state permit doesn't exist. They must recognize it, just like they recognize your driver's license, while still enforcing reasonable boundaries around private property and sensitive government locations. This next rule is about avoiding expensive and potentially life-destroying mistakes. Even though H.R. 38 dramatically improves how states recognize your carry rights and eliminates most of the confusion around state borders, it does not override federal law in any way. Federal gun-free zones stay exactly the same as they are today in February 2026. Post offices, federal courthouses, and other federally controlled buildings remain completely off-limits to concealed carry. Your concealed carry permit, even with nationwide recognition under H.R. 38, does not give you permission to carry inside those specific federal locations. That line is absolutely clear, and it does not move under this legislation. The same restriction applies to school zones that are governed by the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act. H.R. 38 does not weaken or bypass any federal restrictions on firearms. Federal authority over federal property and federal zones stays fully intact. Here's why this distinction matters critically. One of the biggest problems gun owners face in 2026 is confusion about overlapping jurisdictions. City rules, county ordinances, state statutes, and federal laws all overlap in ways that create traps. H.R. 38 fixes the state-level chaos by making permit recognition consistent and predictable across all 50 states. But federal law operates on a completely separate track, and that distinction still matters enormously. For example, many national parks and wildlife refuges follow their own specific rules. In many cases, you can legally carry there if you follow the particular regulations of that specific park or refuge. But step into a federal courthouse on that same trip, and carrying remains completely illegal with severe penalties. That line between state recognition and federal prohibition has not changed under H.R. 38. Think of this rule as a critical safety rail built into the legislation. It keeps nationwide reciprocity from being misunderstood or misapplied. It prevents carriers from assuming that recognition in all 50 states also means recognition on all federal property. It does not and never will. Federal courts have upheld these federal restrictions for years through consistent rulings, and H.R. 38 leaves them completely untouched by design. What the bill does is remove the confusion and conflict between individual states, not blur the boundaries of federal law. The takeaway is simple and critical. You no longer have to worry about which individual state honors your permit or whether your credentials from Florida work in Pennsylvania, but you absolutely still need to stay aware of federal locations and federal restrictions. Respect those boundaries and you stay protected legally. This rule brings clarity without creating new risks. And for responsible carriers who want to follow the law, that clarity is just as important as expanded rights. Here's the rule that serves as the backbone of everything H.R. 38 stands for. Right now, in February 2026, if you hold a valid concealed carry permit issued by your home state, That permit can become completely worthless the moment you cross into certain other states. That kind of legal patchwork has turned law-abiding gun owners into accidental criminals for decades while politicians looked the other way. Make sure you're subscribed, make sure you're informed, and make sure you're ready to fight for rights that should never have been in question.